A great place to begin our forward fuselage is with the firewall. Now I have the firewall on the table with the flange pointing down, and the first thing we need to do is draw some accurate lines that will help us precisely place and drill components on the firewall face. So the first thing we want to do is locate and draw a line exactly 395 from the bottom. Now the bottom of the firewall is flat, so it will make it easy to accurately measure. Now be sure to verify all of these measurements I'm mentioning with your plans. So we have one line at 395 millimeters from the bottom. We also want another line, a little hard to see here, drawn at 160 millimeters from the bottom going all the way across. Then, by finding the center of these two lines, we can create the center line of the fuselage, a very accurate vertical center line, and draw that in. And then finally, we need two sets of lines that are equal distance off the center, 420 millimeters apart, or another way to say that is 210 millimeters from the center, for a total of 420 millimeters, running from the bottom up to our 395 millimeter line up here. Once we have these lines in place, we can go ahead now and work with the components that we are going to attach to the firewall. Now, the first component we'll deal with is the upper channel, and that is 7F7-1. One side of the flange is longer than the other. The longer flange will be the one that will be placed down. And this is going to be placed so that the top of the channel is even with the line that we marked. So it's going to end up sitting just like this. Mark on the inside of this lip here a center line. We'll see if we can see that a little bit closer. Okay, now we want to draw a center line. It's going to be for our rivets all the way along that edge, and then we want to mark off our rivets. Now notice on your plan that the first rivet from each end of the lip has to be 45 millimeters in from the edge. Our engine mount is going to go in here, so it's important that that's a no rivet zone. So we start at 45 millimeters and then mark off every 35 millimeters going across. Also, it's important to mark the center of the distance from end to end, and then of course all the way to the other end, allowing for the 45 millimeters at the other end also. This will be located, as I mentioned, so that the top of the shelf lines up with the line that we drew. And of course, the center line that you drew will line up with the center of the firewall. So it's important to locate it just correctly. And then, rather than drilling all of our rivet lines as we marked, we want to hold off on doing all of them because we are going to have other components up here. So the best thing to do for now is, after making sure you have this placed properly, again, the top of the shelf should line up with the line you drew up here. The center line that you drew on the flange should line up with the center line. And then simply drill your first hole and your last hole using a number 40 drill bit. Eventually these will be A5, but for now just a number 40 drill bit. And then one of the holes in this area here and one of the holes over there. So for now just drill 4 holes so that we leave this area clear until we get the other components on there. One little tip here, one suggestion I'll make is that drilling these holes, of course you have this flange here and it's going to get a little tight getting the drill in to get a nice straight shot at the lip. couple things you can do. One thing you can do is mark the other edge, the outer edge, in the same fashion with the center line and then all of the rivet marks, and then you can drill this way. Or you can use your angle drill, which we'll demonstrate a little bit later, to get in here and drill. So either way, we do want to make sure we drill the holes precisely and at a straight angle into the firewall. So I'm first going to drill my 4 holes and then drill them into the firewall. And here I have clecoed my 4 locations and have the upper channel in place. Now the next thing we're going to deal with are these 7F7-5. They look like Z angles, if you will, and they get located along the line like that. And the other one's going to go like this with the bend facing inward. Bend facing inward. Now, before we drill this in place, we have something special we need to do about marking the flange for the rivets, and we'll need to get a close-up of that. Notice the plans call for having a double row of rivets because this flange is actually quite large. So what I did was I marked 2 lines. The first line about 10 millimeters in from the edge, give us our edge distance, and the next line about 17 millimeters in from the edge. So 2 parallel lines where our rivet's going to go. And also notice the plans say that the first 80 millimeters from the bottom is a no rivet zone. So our first rivet will start 80 millimeters from the bottom. Now the plans also call for a 60 millimeter spacing. So I staggered my 2. So 60 millimeters, all the way up. But do notice before marking this completely that as it's located on here, you'll want to be aware of the line you drew, where that intersects, so you'll want a rivet right at that point where the line intersects. And then also all the way up at the top, one of them is going to intersect through the upper channel. So in mine, I have a total of 3, 6, 9, 11 rivets I will have in each channel. I'm going to go ahead and pre-drill my rivet marks. Then I will take it up to the firewall. I will first, though, before I drill into the firewall, is remove the upper channel because it's very important to make sure that these are properly placed. They need to go right along the center. The center of 7F75 needs to go right along the center of this line. This line is important along with the line over here because our engine mount will bolt up. So these need to be centered on this line from top to bottom. So make sure you locate the line. Another point is before drilling this in is when you do have your channel up here, you don't want to push this too far in to the radius in here, right? This starts to radius up, so make sure you don't have it jammed in too far. It's got to sit flat in this corner. So whether you have to trim this piece or not, do make sure that you don't have it jammed up too far. I'm going to add a center mark in the exact center at the bottom and at the top so that when I place it along my line, I can get it exactly centered. (7F7-8). We need to use the plans and lay out the location of all the holes and drill them with the number 40 size drill. I'm going to do this twice, one for each plate, and don't forget the one in the center. And then once that's done, we want to use the lower channel 7F7-2, and then using 7F7-2, choose one end and mark at the top. And then we want to measure from the bottom a line 160 millimeters from the bottom. Place a line there. And then take our 7F7-8 that we drilled out and watch for this line through the center hole, lining it up nice and even. We can go ahead then and drill the rest of the number 40 size holes into the lower channel and then attach with Clecos. We're going to do this to both sides. Remember, that line that we watched in the hole was 160 millimeters from the bottom. Check your plans to verify that. And then we're going to open up this hole to 5/8 inch diameter. We're going to do that with it Clecoed to the bottom channel so that our large hole will be drilled through both pieces simultaneously. And of course, we're going to do that on both sides. And there we have our 5/8 inch hole drilled. Now what we want to do is on the bottom side, we want to draw a line which is 33 millimeters from the bottom of the channel up. Draw a line all the way to the edge of our doubler. In fact, I even added a little line up here. What we're going to do is remove this piece. And we're just going to use our snips to do that. One thing that we do first, though, is at that corner, we want to drill use a drill bit and drill a hole in the corner so that we don't have a sharp corner. And then we can go ahead and use our shears and cut that out. And there's our relief hole. And I'm going to go ahead now and use my shears to simply cut the line there. Our next step is to mark the rivet lines inside the channel. Now, first step is to draw a center line from the bottom all the way to the top, right in the dead center. And then our actual rivet lines are 30 millimeters to each side of the center line. So you want to draw two more lines, 60 millimeters apart, and of course 30 millimeters from the center. Those will become our rivet lines. Now, also, where the bungee pin is going to be located, draw a perpendicular line. That will be the start of our rivet line. In other words, we're going to start at where the bungee pin is located and then use a rivet spacing of 40 millimeters for the rivets. However, because the bungee cord will literally sit right underneath the pin where you made those large holes here, we're not going to put the first rivet at that intersection, but rather move it in 15 millimeters, just at this one point. And same with the other side. Don't put a rivet at the intersection, move it up 15 millimeters. Now, the rest of the rivets, though, will be spaced on our rivet lines at 40 millimeter intervals. So I'll go ahead and mark this and see if that makes sense to you. And here's the rivet pattern I came up with. These are spaced 40 millimeters apart. These will be A5s eventually. But notice right underneath the bungee pin, I will not place a rivet here. I will move in 15 millimeters and place one here. Same over here. Won't place one at the intersection, but we'll move in 15 millimeters and place one here. And those will be A5s. I will go ahead and drill those and then place the channel where it goes right in here. And again, remember, when you do go to eventually drill into the firewall, you don't want to jam this up too tight into the radius of the lip there. Here are all the holes drilled and clecoed. Now we're going to talk about installing the gussets 7F79, and these will be located right like that. And right like that. Here's a picture of the gusset clamped in place. Now notice the holes I've drilled. I'm going to get 6 holes into the side of the channel, and then into the top up here there's going to be 4, but I'm only going to drill the 2 middle ones for now. Don't drill the one down here, because there'll be another part on top that will come through and place this. And I'll drill the one all the way up at the top up here from the top also. I drew a line here just to indicate where the top of this channel was when I located these 6 holes. And also make sure that this top flange isn't too long, such that it rides up on the radiuses inside this channel here. We want a pretty flat, tight fit up there. I'm going to go ahead and drill this with the number 40 and cleco. Now we're ready to install 7F7-7, the top channel stiffener. Just an L here. And first thing we want to do is to draw a center line down both of the flanges, because that's going to be where we're going to place our rivets. And this is going to get located right in there. Now, first we want to trim the ends. So that they look nice and match up with the top channel there. I'll do that to both sides. Now we're basically going to set a pitch of rivets into the firewall and into the top channel. Now before we do that, we want to locate some places where rivets aren't going to go. The first example is at each of the ends we have a no rivet zone. And that applies from this point to the end, 45 millimeters, check your plans. It will not apply into the channel, but into the firewall. No rivets for the first 45 millimeters at both ends. And we want to mark where 7F7-3 is going to be located right here. And what's nice to do is to put a mark on both sides. because we do want 3 rivets in here, but as we lay out our rivet plan, we want to be aware that 7F7-3 is going to be located there. Now our goal is to have a pitch 40 for our rivet location. Now along the edge that is going on top of the channel, the one thing you want to look out for is that 2 of the rivets need to go into the gusset we just installed. So I marked a location in line with the gusset underneath. So those 2 locations have to be placed for the purpose of the gusset. Then from there we can do a space 40 millimeters all the way to each end, left and right. And of course, leaving a 10 millimeter edge distance at the very end. On the flange that goes against the firewall, remember we have our 45 millimeter no rivet zone starting from the end, and then I measured off 40 millimeters for each tick of the rivet, and then stopped where our 7F7-3 is located, and we'll not drill that area until we place that channel in place, and then we'll get 3 rivets inside of there. And same thing with the other end. Started at the first position of the no rivet zone, after the no rivet zone, 45 millimeters, and then measured off 40 millimeters, and again stopped when we came up to the channel. So I'll drill those with a number 40 and put that in place. And drill and cleco. Now we're ready to install the upper channel, 7F7-3. First thing we want to do is mark 3 lines down its center. Well, 1 line down the center, and then the 2 other lines just 10 millimeters in from the edge. Now at the very top, we have a no rivet zone. 60 millimeters will be fine. And then from that point down to the bottom, leaving a 10 millimeter edge difference, we want 5 equally spaced holes. So from 60 millimeters from the top, 5 equally spaced holes down to the bottom on all 3 lines. So I drilled these out, and then this will fit using the center lines as our way of lining it up with the very center, and we'll place that just like this. And again, don't want to push that up too tightly against the channel so that it rides up on the radius there. So don't push it up too tight there, and get it centered, and go ahead and drill the holes into the firewall. Now we've turned the firewall over so its back is facing us, and I drew a line 160 millimeters from the bottom, and that should intersect a couple of the holes we have drilled already from the front side. And we're ready to install a Z with the bend aimed down. And our goal on the Z is to space our rivets with a 40 millimeter pitch after drawing a center line down the middle of the flange. Now what we want to be careful about are the existing holes that are already in place. So when planning our rivet line, we want to take into account those holes that are already there. There are some already in the center, and then some where we previously drilled from the front. So keeping that in mind, we can lay out our rivet pitch on the Z, but in my example, I have circled the areas that are close to the holes already in place on the firewall, and those are the ones I will not drill. Rather, I will, instead of drilling those locations, I will wait and drill from the front of the firewall back out so that I don't interfere with the existing holes. Also, these two guys here, even though there aren't holes in the firewall, these represent locations that are very close to our vertical channel. So I'm going to not drill these also and drill the holes from the front of the firewall so I can make sure I don't interfere with the edges of the vertical channel on the front of the firewall. So basically I have marked 4 locations on my Z that I will not drill, but will rather drill from the front of the firewall. Now from the front of the firewall, the holes we need to drill to get through the Z include those that were on the vertical uprights, and also in the center. We also need to add a hole right in the very center. And also we need to mark for a rivet about 10 millimeters outside of each side of the vertical channel. And then at this time, it's also a good idea to go back and finish drilling any of the rivet locations that we deferred earlier that can now be drilled. Now it's time to lay out and make the slots for the steering rods. There'll be 2 of them. Now the first step is to draw a line using your Sharpie from the bottom along the edge up to about the bungee pin. Right along the edge there, make a straight line on both sides. Then what we're going to do is remove the channel and lay out the slot on both sides of the channel. Now, to lay out this slot, we're going to look at our plans carefully and notice that we want to make a line that's 45 millimeters from the bottom. That'll be the bottom of the slot, and then the slot will extend up for 95 millimeters. So I'm going to lay that out, and by the way, according to the plans, it is 15 millimeters wide. I've laid out the areas. Now, because we're not going to be allowed to have any sharp corners, we want this to be rounded. So we're going to end up using a drill. Now I can kind of mark what it's going to look like by using the cap of my Sharpie here. Okay, so we're going to have a rounded edge. So I need to drill a hole large enough to make that rounded. So I'm going to have a hole here and a hole here, and then I'm going to cut the lines between the holes to get a nice clean cutout with rounded ends. And using the jigsaw with a fine tooth blade, metal blade, I was able to make a nice cutout. Now I'll clean this up with a file, tin snips, and get this looking just right, but I'm very close to what I need to have. And then we'll repeat that for the other side. And there, I finished up the hole. It's sure nice having good files available. I have a round file and a flat file, but was able to clean that up. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. Do the best job you can, and if it goes a little bit oversized too, that's not going to hurt. And then you get a second try over on the other side. Now we're going to talk about installing 7F74C, the bearing for the nose strut, and we're going to install the upper bearing. We're going to work on that first. Now, first thing to do is to take your nose strut and just temporarily stick it through the hole here from the bottom. We're looking at the top shelf here, and the bearing this, of course, is going to go on the inside of the shelf, but for now we can fit it by placing it over the nose strut like that. And then what we want to do is trim off the top so that it can fit underneath the lip on the other side over there. Now I've drawn a line to indicate where I'm going to cut this off to keep it within the lip. And of course, because this edge of the top shelf here is radiused, we're going to also use our sander to get a radius on this sharp edge after we cut it off, so that it fits nice and tight underneath here, but also has some contour so it'll fit into this radius nose here. And I'm also going to trim off a little bit off the bottom so that it doesn't interfere with the rivet holes down here at the bottom. So I got my line marked here. I'm going to mark cut off about 10 millimeters from the other side too. The width is just fine as per the plans. And then once we cut this, we can then try and fit it where it's supposed to go on the other side of on the underside of the shelf over here. And here I've cut down the bearing, and I've used my sanding belt to put this radius on there. You can see that. So that radius will allow a nice tight fit under the shelf. So this will be installed right up like that. And of course, to keep perfect alignment with the shelf before we drill this, and by the way, we already have 4 pre-drilled holes in the shelf that we'll use. But to keep proper alignment, we want to take the nose strut and actually go ahead and install it through the shelf. And keeping the strut parallel with the firewall, we now have perfect alignment to drill our 4 holes. So I'll leave this in place while drilling, holding this tight to the bottom of the shelf through the pre-drilled holes in the top of the shelf. These small holes will eventually be taking a 3/16 inch and 3 bolt and nut to attach it, so this can be a removable item if we ever have to. So I'm going to go ahead and drill this through the pre-drilled holes, 4 of them that exist in the shelf. Well, now we can discuss how to attach the lower bearing 7F8-4 to the bottom of the firewall. Now, we basically have 2 directions we need to position it in. It's got to be from left to right, properly centered, And then from up and down, the bearing surface has to be at the correct height to keep our tube perfectly parallel and level to the face of the firewall. So let's talk about how we can get this positioned properly. The bend, of course, will bend up, and we temporarily have it clamped to the lip of the bottom of the firewall. First thing we want to do is place our 2-inch tube into the bearing at the top, which of course is already fixed in its position, and then lower the tube into our bearing. Now our goal is to have this tube perfectly level above the surface, and to the center it is supposed to be 60 millimeters. Since the bearing at the top is already fixed in its height, we simply want to get the tube evenly placed along the surface of the firewall. So I set up my square and got it set so that it perfectly rides the top of the tube, and I got that distance, and I transferred it to the very front, also sitting on the firewall. You can look at it this way too. And by raising and lowering the bearing, I want it exactly the same height up at the front as I do all the way at the back. Once I have that at the right level, I then want to mark the bearing in relation to the lip of the firewall with a little mark so that I know that I can replace it back on the firewall and get it lined up exactly at the same location. Also, that little tick mark I can draw across the bearing, and that will become the line for my rivets. So I'll mark that on both sides once I have it aligned properly. Now, the other position we need to adjust is from left to right, and that's actually quite easy to do also. We're simply going to take a look on the other side of the bearing. Now we're looking at the other side of the bearing, and I've marked a center line exactly in the middle of the lower bearing and matching that up with the center line of our vertical channel, and that will give us the proper left to right position. I can then remove the clamps and then connect my two marks, which were centered on the lip of the bottom of the firewall, and draw a line, and that will become my rivet line. And looking at your plans, you'll notice that we are to have our A5 rivets spaced 20 millimeters apart, which I believe will give us 8 rivets all the way across. And follow your plans carefully in laying out the holes for the rivets. Basically, you'll strike a center line, and then the first 2 holes are 15 millimeters apart, 7.5 millimeters off each center, and then 20 millimeter spacing for the rest of the distance. I drilled these with number 40 holes, and now I will take this up to the bottom lip of the firewall and drill into the firewall lip after I line up my edge marks and cleco this. I'm going to talk about creating 7F8-6, which is the nose stop. Now, it's made out of a 1.5 by 1 aluminum piece of an extrusion, an angle, and you're going to trim off the 1-inch side, and the 1.5-inch side will also get a notch cut into it. Very important to follow your plans very accurately on this piece. It is a little bit challenging to get the tolerances they want. And also I've pre-drilled the holes they have requested, and also on the very bottom there will be 3 holes. And you're going to want to very precisely line these out, mark them out before you drill them. The degree of precision to which you make this piece will be important in the functioning of your nose gear. Now, you're going to make these, one left and one right, so the other one is a mirror image of the other. And it's important when cutting out the ramp part of the nose stop that when you make the second piece, both ramps are identical, so that when the nose piece rides on them, which it will do simultaneously, it will be quite even. So if you can cut these out together, or at least trace one on the other, whatever means is easiest for you, do try and make each piece very identical in this regard, and it will make for a smoother operating nose piece. We're going to place our nose stop in place so we can see where it's going to fit. Here's the one, and this one will go down into the corner flat against the bearing and the inside of the channel, and it will go just like that. And the other one, its mirror image, will go over there. Now these will get bolted with the 3 holes into the bearing, and the small hole here will go into the side of the channel. Now, before we go ahead and drill those holes, what we want to do is place our 2-inch metal tube in here and verify that as the nose rubs against this bearing, that the tube is in the correct location. So what I'm going to do is take these off for now and insert the metal tube. And then I'm going to go ahead and attach these pieces, the nose stops, with clamps back in here. And I'll show you what I mean as far as the checking the alignment. Okay, I have clamped the nose stop to the bearing using this clamp here. And keeping the bearing 90 degrees to the firewall, and bringing our 2-inch tube to rest right in the center of our nose stop. When the tube is in this location, what we want to do is go look at the top of the tube, up at the top, and make sure it's even with the top shelf. Let's take a look. Now we're zooming in at the very top of the tube, and notice how the very top of the tube is flush with the top of the shelf. And that's good, because what we want to happen is to have that tube share its weight, because it'll be under the stress of a bungee cord, partially on this top shelf and then partially on the nose stops. So if we have everything engineered properly, when the tube touches the nose stop, the top of the tube is flush with the top of the shelf. And that's just something we want to verify, that we have everything put together properly so that happens. If you're far off, in other words, if that tube is extended above the shelf or below the shelf, we need to make some adjustment probably in the nose stop to ensure that the height of the tube is such that it will come to rest at the nose stop at the same time that it reaches the flush at the top shelf. Because we will put an attachment on the top of that 2-inch metal tube, which will then ride on the top of the shelf and support the tube. If that makes any sense. Well, it will eventually. We can go ahead and install our nose stops. Before drilling, make sure that the bearing is 90 degrees to the surface of the firewall, because it does bend a little bit until we get it drilled. So assuming that that is 90 degrees, we can go ahead and drill our 3 small holes into the bearing surface and 1 small hole into the side of the vertical channel. And we'll leave these holes at number size 40 for now. Eventually this hole will be enlarged and receive an AN3 bolt. And we'll leave these 3 holes at size 40 for now because we're going to have more parts to assemble on the other side of the bearing down here. So let's drill and cleco both nose stops at this time. And I did use an angle drill to get some of these holes, because that's the only way to get into those tight locations. Okay, now we're going to install the nylon bearing on the bottom here. Now, what I have is I'm just going to use the end of the tube, in fact the wrong end of the tube, but I'm looking for a nice 2-inch diameter pipe, and our tube does fine. And I'm just going to place it here, okay, but before I do, our nylon bearing is going to locate here, so I'm going to slip it over the end of the tube for alignment purposes only. Slip this in, and then this is going to line this plastic bearing up just perfectly. And then I'm going to go ahead and drill through the 2 holes on each of the 2 nose stops into, or back drill into the plastic bearing here. And by keeping the pipe in place here and keeping it level, I'll have really nice alignment for this plastic bearing. So I'm going to go ahead and back drill 4 holes and cleco. And there we have the bearing drilled with the 4 holes. Now what we're going to do is reverse. I'm going to reverse my clecos here, put them on the back side. And then I'm going to take the tube once again. Obviously my alignment is just fine. It slips in and out. And now 7F85 and 7F85. We'll slip that over again for alignment purposes. I will clamp this and then back drill through the 4 holes, and that will complete our bearing surface. And then those 4 holes in here will be enlarged to take a AN3 bolt, so those will be 4 3/16 size holes. And because we're back drilling them through the nose stops, all 3 pieces will be lined up very nicely, the plastic and the bearing. And we will have completed our mission. Okay, we got all 4 holes drilled through our bottom bearing. Next thing we might do is trim the corners. If you look at your plans, you'll see that the corner's trimmed. Put this in the bandsaw and trim both of these at the same time. Also, I'm going to trim off about 10 millimeters off the bottom bearing here, because I noticed they're obstructing the 3rd set of holes at the bottom down here. And when we're done with that, the last thing we need to do is open up all 6 holes to 3/16. Drill those straight through, keep everything lined up. And then the very last step will be to cut the green plastic bearing in half. The reason we have to do that is there would be no way to get our tube into the hole if we can't break this green bearing into 2 pieces. All right, I have the bearing all trimmed up, the corners and the top edge, and I removed enough off the bottom to give me clearance. Now, the last thing I need to do is I drew a line halfway between the top and bottom, and I'm going to slice the green bearing in half. so that it becomes two pieces. And then put it all back together and enlarge the holes to the 3/16 size, and we are finished with our bearing. And here's the bearing all in place. I've just stuck some bolts temporarily through the holes to demonstrate its alignment. You should definitely mark your components from bottom versus top. Otherwise, when you disassemble, it's very easy to get them reversed and they won't go back together very nicely that way. In order to get the black steering tube into the bearing, make no mistake, you do have to take apart all of the pieces, including the nose gear stops. Otherwise, you won't be able to get it in. So keep this in mind if you ever need to remove the tube to replace the bungee cord. These components have to be removed, and that's why they're held in with bolts and nuts. We won't install the bungee and the pin at this time because we haven't riveted all the components together, so they're not quite strong enough to support that. At this time, we can consider preparing the firewall for final riveting. Virtually all of the holes that we've drilled, except for the specific ones we've mentioned, need to be drilled out for an A5 rivet. So we need to do that. And of course, to deburr and put on our corrosion protection. One place we should keep in mind is the doublers for the bungee pin. The rivets for this doubler plate need to be inserted from the inside out. In other words, the heads of the rivet need to be towards the inside of the channel. And the reason for that is we don't want our bungee cords rubbing against the stems of the rivet. So all of the rivets through the doubler plate, again, must be inserted from the inside of the vertical channel aimed outwards. Do not rivet the bearing plates 7F8-4. These rivets need to be not installed till later because we're going to have the floor of the fuselage inserted there. So do not install permanently any of the components for the lower bearing. We'll do that later. But we can rivet up all of the other components on the firewall with A5 rivets. Okay, we're going to prepare 7F10-1. This channel here has a front and a rear. The front has got the 90-degree bend in it, and the rear has this sharper angle. This is going to go into the fuselage, and this side, the front, is going to be towards where you sit, towards the front of the plane. I marked the front so that we wouldn't forget which side the front is, and I marked the center. In other words, measuring from one side to the other, I found the exact center and drew a line. In fact, I transferred that line all the way to the edge right up here. Okay, so now that we have the center, we have a couple of things we need to trim. At the front side, we're going to need to trim the flange at both ends. At the front, we want to mark over 14 millimeters, read your plans, but 14 millimeters in up at this top point here, at the top of the bend, all the way back to the very corner. So we're going to remove this, and then at the lip here, I made a mark just to continue the cut. But since it's 14 millimeters from here to here, the distance is greater when you get all the way to the lip here. The way to find this mark here is either to continue this straight line with a straight edge, or to be more precise, measure 1,000 millimeters, or measure 500 millimeters from this point to the center line you marked at the center. So from this mark to the mark at the opposite end will be exactly 1,000 millimeters, or from here to the center will be 500. And that's one way to confirm that you have this marked properly. So basically we're going to cut this all the way off at both ends. Make sure you're doing it to the front, not the rear. At the rear, we do have a small trimming job. Hard to see, but we need to take off 3 millimeters measured from the very corner in, 3 millimeters in. This will be just a very narrow little cut here. You know that you will have this dimensioned properly because you should be able to slide this end into your fuselage at the opening on the floor. And that should fit in between the two longerons on each end. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this. I'm going to use my snips and then follow up with a file to make a nice cut. Now we're going to fabricate 7F10-2 channel doublers. Now there'll be 4 of these, and we can drill them all at the same time if we want. We need to lay out a row of rivets. Here I've laid out the row. 10 millimeters from the edge for the first rivet, and then 85 for the last one. Check your plans on this. And then there'll be 6 evenly spaced rivets between, including those 2 end points. Those will eventually take A5 rivets. And we can stack all 4 of these up after we drill one of them and use them as a template to drill the rest. But those rivets will be centered right down the center like that. Okay, I got the channel cut, and now I'm going to flip it over and insert the doubler. And this is going to go right inside here, just like that. The edge will be lined up over here, and I can go ahead and drill the 6 holes in here. And I'll have this about centered between the top and bottom. Now, you can use an angle drill to get these 6 holes. I started with just a size 40 initially. And you can use your angle drill to get in here. Or, if you want, if you're careful, you can come to the outside and drill it on the outside. So you don't have to use an angle drill. And then when you're all done, of course, you would mount it inside. So either way, just keep track of what you're doing and refer to your plans if you have any doubt as to the position. So there'll be 4 of these, 1 on each end and both sides of the channel in there. Now we're ready to lay out our floor. 7F87 is a top and bottom to the front floor pan. Look closely on the pilot side. Notice there are 2 rivets north of the horizontal hat stiffener. On the passenger side, there is only 1 rivet. 1 rivet versus 2 rivets. The reason for that is the pivot point for the rudder pedals will be further forward on the pilot side than they will on the passenger side. So there is a top and bottom to this floor pan, because if you flip it over, those will be in the wrong position. But that is the only difference, is that location of that one additional hole. And 7F88. Now 7F88 you may have to trim to the desired size. Both of these floor sheets need to have a center line drawn accurately from one end to the other on both sides. We're going to use these lines for alignment purposes. So make sure you draw a center line, both sides, 7F88 and 7F87. In addition, on 7F88, you want to draw a line 18 millimeters from one side to the other along the narrower edge. Once this is done, you're ready to align these two pieces. I'm simply going to overlap 7F87 on top of 88, and I'm simply going to carefully align the center lines so they come together, and then the line from side to side that was 18 millimeters over, and that will be the limit for my lip. And once I have that aligned, I can go ahead and drill through the pre-drilled holes in 8-7 using a number 40 drill bit and cleco these two sheets together. Okay, I have my clecos all in place. I have slipped 7F10-1, the channel under 7F88 here. And the reason I want to do that is I want to mark the edges mark this edge here, and the same on the other side, because I am now going to remove a piece out, and notice I've drawn a line 10 millimeters from the edge on top of 7F88 all the way up and down. Notice I have drawn a line the length of the channel 10 millimeters from the edge all the way along the edge, and then starting from 10 millimeters from the edge where I drew the line, I'm going to mark a pitch 40 rivet spacing all the way to the other end. What we're going to do is drill a number 40 drill bit through these rivet markings, and then we will place on top of 7F88, looking for the line through the holes we made to make sure we have the proper edge distance. Now, what's also important, of course, is when we're ready to match these up, that we match the center line of the two pieces together when we're ready to drill that, so that we get the center line and then we seed the line through the holes that we make on here. So I'm going to go ahead and drill the holes in the flange of 7F10-1 all the way up and down the length. And there I've drilled through the flange and into the bottom. One thing you might want to do before you actually go ahead and drill is to confirm that the distance from the very front of 7F87 to the edge right here is 1,300 millimeters. That way we know we have the distance correct for the floor from the very tip, the very front, to this back edge of 7F10-1, 1,300 millimeters. As we prepare the fuselage sides, there's one component that needs to be trimmed, and it's the long extrusion extension. And we need to trim this now before we assemble it to our floor, because the length of this extrusion will hinder the installation at a later time. So let's carry the fuselage side up to the rear fuselage and see how it will fit. Now we want to pay particular attention to this bend. The very bend is where the rear fuselage and the side will come together. So when we carry this up to the rear fuselage, we want to line up this crease in the side with the point where the rear fuselage and the side come together. In other words, this overlap of about an inch here will overlap over the rear fuselage, and the edge of the rear fuselage will be underneath this crease on the inside. So let's take this up to the rear fuselage, and you might get a second person to help you hold it in place. And again, we're going to try and find the proper length for this end of this extrusion. The inside should look something like this. The bend in the extrusion should be just below the vertical channel on the side. In fact, that bend is where the fuselage and the side come together. Now what's critical is the arm of the side should go up and end somewhere in this location here. But this is the extrusion you need to trim because it may be too long and hit the upright. So you want to trim the end of that until it fits, and you can get the side installed all the way so that the bend in the extrusion is even with the seam, and the bend in the side is aligned up where the side and the fuselage come together. By trimming this extrusion now, it will save you a whole bunch of aggravation later when you go to install the sides and the floor panel all together. That way you know it will fit, because these arms tend to be a little bit too long and they need to be trimmed at the very end up there. The exact location of the end of this arm will be located when we install the front fuselage to the rear fuselage, as the angle will be set permanently. But roughly speaking, the angle is set by matching up the bend in your fuselage side with the very outer edge of the rear fuselage, because that's where the angle will appear when the front and the rear fuselage come together. You want to do this for both sides. Okay, I've taken the passenger side panel and slide it under our floor. Now, what we want to do is check the alignment of where 7F10-1 meets the side panel here. Now, one thing we want to do is make sure our side panel is all the way against the edge. So this is tight between these two pieces. And then the cutout area of the side panel must be even or above with the top of this channel. So I'm going to trace a small line here. I got a little trimming to do. I want to cut out a little bit more of this material so that it's definitely above, because right now I'm below the lip here. It doesn't matter if this is too high above here, it'll end up being covered up. But we do need to cut this out there. I also removed the rivets temporarily from this location so that this would sit nice and flat on the table while I make this adjustment for the cutout here. So I'm going to take care of that on both sides. Our seat front 7F11-1 needs to be prepared before we do any installation. Couple of large holes which the factory has put in. We got to make sure we have our 1 1/4 inch hole in the center here, and then the large hole for where our stick attachment is going to go through and move back and forth as we move the stick left and right, and we need to make sure this hole is in place. And then our next step will be to go and set up the holes on the edge where our cables and wires will feed through on the left and right side. And one of our first tasks is to prepare the holes in the corner where a lot of our cables and wires are going to go through. So make sure when you look at the plans, you have the front facing towards you when you set this up, because the left and the right are a little bit different. But go ahead and, using the plans, lay out the holes. Got 4 holes. I'm just going to drill the size 40 hole for now. We'll enlarge these a little bit later. And like I say, the other side has a slightly different layout. And then we will turn it around and prepare our doubler, which is just a piece of 25 thousandths. And this will go on the back, and we'll attach that and drill through the holes and enlarge them and get this all ready. I've turned 7F11-1 around, so we're now facing the back. And over here I have the passenger side. And what we're going to do now is, of course, here are the 4 holes that I pre-drilled carefully using our plans. I'm now preparing 7F11-1A, which is simply a doubler. Cut this to the size of the plans. And this will be installed right here with rivets. Now, prior to installing it, the plan said that we were to have 20 rivets, so I laid out 5 evenly spaced tick marks across the top, and then 4 going from top to bottom. Now, I'm not going to drill all 20 rivet locations yet because we have the large holes to make. Basically, I've filled in the tick marks for my second row, and I'm going to drill these 4. Place this exactly where it's supposed to go, and then drill and cleco this to the back. Then I can flip the seat front around and drill and enlarge the holes so that I catch both the doubler and the seat back at the same time. And then after that's in place, I can go in and fill in the other locations for the rivets, but we have a little more work to do here first. Now I have it clecoed on, drilled my 4 holes. Now I'm going to turn this around and we'll drill the holes from the other side. Now, it's important to cut each hole to the proper size. So I have labeled mine so I don't make a mistake. And we'll proceed to drill through both 7F11-1 and the doubler behind it. 3/4 hole, 7/16, 13/16, 13/16 hole. And I'm also going to clamp the doubler on tight I'm just going to use my unit bit in my drill to make these holes. And then, of course, repeat for the opposite side of the seat front, keeping in mind that the holes are in a different location and different sizes. And here's what it looks like with the holes drilled. And this is again on the passenger side. If I turn it around, and along this line, we're going to have an L. We'll install that very shortly on the back. And we're going to hold off to drill the rest of the rivets until we're a little further along. Probably got this hole right here a little too close. So when laying your rivet line, you might want to wait in drilling that hole till later. At a location 360 millimeters from the center, we need to locate a line because we are going to install an L angle. We may need to angle the top slightly so that we can fit it up underneath. And we need to get 6 rivets, evenly spaced from top to bottom, and line it up on that line, and that'll take us to the edge of that doubler that we put in. And then I'll go ahead and drill and cleco. I located 10 holes. These are all going to be A5 eventually. Now, right around this top opening here, and this is on the passenger side, I've cut my plastic fair lead, and that's going to end up right here, attached with 4 holes. Do not rivet this on until much later when we join the 2 fuselage halves together. We can go ahead and, when it's time to do the riveting, rivet up all of the other holes, but do leave this edge off because this is where it will join the fuselage cabin, and we'll do that after we join the fuselage halves together. And also don't rivet on the plastic fair lead, but do cut this as per plans, line it up. Be attached with the 4 holes. We want a total of 20 holes in the doubler. And then the center hole here is such that if we were to flip this around, it will end up looking like that. And this is where the rudder cable will come right through that hole there. Now we're going to attach 7F11-1 to our floor. And we'll, of course, line it up using our center marks to accurately get it centered. And then, because the pre-drilled holes are on the floor, what I'm going to do is turn the floor and 7F11-1 upside down and drill through the pre-drilled holes into the bottom. I'm first going to mark a center line along the lip just to make sure I can see that center line through the pre-drilled holes, and then again, as I mentioned, drill from the floor up into the lip. I'll flip this over on the workbench to get that done. We need to prepare our strut fittings. Now, these are going to end up sliding into 7F10-1 by simply putting the tabs inside here. And they simply go in like that all the way there. However, the rear tab on both sides is too long and is actually covering up one of the holes you drilled through the doublers. You notice as I back this off, you can see the hole right here. So what we need to do is cut this tab off so that when it's all the way inserted, it will not cover up that hole. So make a line, use your hacksaw or bandsaw, and cut the steel tab off so that it does not get in the way of what's going to be a rivet head right there. The front tab up here should not have a problem with the very first hole. So let's prepare both of our strut fittings in that way by making an appropriate cut. Couple holes in our top of our gear strut. Make sure you look at your plans. I've located my holes about halfway between the two braces here and about 10 millimeters down from the top of the lip. Instead of drilling this way, I'm going to turn it around just because it's much easier to drill from the other side. So I've marked the holes from the other side. I'm going to drill these out to a size 40 and then to a size 30. Do not drill any of the other holes for the gear strut out at this time. We will drill those out later. But these two will get eventually rivets in them. For now, we're just going to use them to be able to cleco up to the side panel. Now we get to assemble all of the components we have built thus far. First, get yourself a pair of 2x4s or other piece of wood to give some height off the table, one for each side. Take your floor assembly with 7F11 attached and slide your two side panels underneath the bottom floor. Do note that 7F11 goes in front of the L angle attached to the sides. And let's take a look at the other side over here. And of course, we've already trimmed our opening for the strut mounts, and that's what we're going to mount next. We are ready to mount our gear struts. Now, the two tabs, one which you have, of course, trimmed off, will fit inside of the two doublers that you have clecoed and placed here. And of course, our opening has been trimmed so that it is clearly above the channel. I'm simply going to slip the tabs in between the two doublers, and it will slide in. Now, again, the reason for the wood was to keep the studs from the strut from running into the table. Now, this will fit in pretty nicely, but it will move up. So you want to raise it up because there's a lip on the strut that needs to engage underneath the channel in here. So you want to make sure you lift up, keeping the edge even with the bottom edge of the side, but raised up as far as it will go. And then we can go ahead and drill through the two holes and cleco the strut to the side panel. And we'll perform the same operation on the other side. Measure across the bottom of your fuselage. That measurement represents the width of your fuselage at the bottom that you're going to use when you adjust the sides of the forward fuselage. So write that number down, and we will use that next. Cut a piece of wood, any scrap piece of wood, to that length, right? It should be somewhere around 1,045 millimeters, give or take, whatever you measured across the outside of the bottom of your fuselage, and then insert that piece of wood right back in here from side to side, right against 7F10-1. And what that will do is provide the length of the fuselage that you want at the rear location from side to side. What we're trying to do is set the width of the rear of the front fuselage accurately so that it reflects the dimension that you took, the measurement of the dimension from the outside bottom of the rear fuselage. Now that will take care of the back side. Here's another look at that piece of wood. Now, we have set the back width of our forward fuselage. What we need to do is come to the front and set the distance of the sides by moving the sides closer and further apart until we get the proper dimension across the front. Check your plans, but 825 millimeters from the bottom front of the side to the opposite bottom front of the other side should be 825 millimeters. And again, we do that by simply moving the sides inward or outward as necessary to come up with that dimension. Once we have set the front to the 825 and the rear to the dimension of our piece of lumber that we've set in there, we can now drill the sides to the floor to make permanent those dimensions. Do not measure and do not worry about the measurement across the top. Those will be set later when we finish the rest of the fuselage. It's only at the bottom that we want to make these measurements permanent by drilling the floor to the sides. At this time, we will not drill or attach 7F11-1 to the side of the fuselage. We'll leave that till later. Make sure you locate the correct row of pre-drilled holes in the floor. Eventually these will be A5 in size. Drill with a smaller size initially. At this time, you can go ahead and drill through the floor with the second set of pre-drilled holes and into the bottom of the cabin side, these guys here, on both sides. Now for our next procedure, let us remove both cabin sides from the floor, unclick them, along with 7F11-1. We'll remove that, and we're just going to work on the two bottom floor sheets. Okay, we're going to install 7F8-1, and this channel is going to go underneath our floor pan. First, we're going to mark a line exactly in the center at both ends. You don't have to go the full length, but at least for several inches on both ends. Then I'm going to lay it flat And we're going to then place it underneath 7F87, the floor pan. Now I disconnected this from 7F8-8, the rear floor pan, and I've slid it underneath the floor pan. And make sure now you got the floor pan facing up. That's why I labeled mine top and bottom. And I placed it right in the center underneath. And now you can see why we drew the line. We want to line that up very accurately. And it is longer than the floor pan and will stick out the rear. And of course, that's why we have the center line, so we can get that lined up perfectly from left to right. Now at the front, of course, we are going to have it flush get that perfectly flush and the lines lined up. Use our number 40 drill bit and drill through the pre-drilled holes on either side of the center line. There are some gaps in the floor pan where there aren't any holes, and that's good. We'll fill those in later with some other items. And notice up front here there aren't any holes because we have the firewall to go there. So I'm going to go ahead and drill through the holes and then cleco. And then later we're going to have to reattach the rear floor pan and drill another few holes to accommodate the part sticking out the end there. Next now is lift our 7F88, the rear floor skin, and slip it underneath the floor. Line up the holes, and we're going to go ahead and cleco this in place. Okay, now we know this extends a little bit past, so what I'm simply going to do is extend the 2 rows of rivet lines and then drill 2 more holes into the rear floor skin. And I'm going to drill 1 more set of holes 35 millimeters from the last hole. There. And then drill my 2 holes there, and that way I've got the last part all connected together. And then we're done. Now we're going to prepare 7F10-3, which is just a piece of aluminum extrusion, but we do have to prepare the ends before we can put this on. On one end, we want to measure 100 millimeters from the top, from the 100 millimeters from the end, and then draw a diagonal line from that 100 millimeter mark all the way down to that point. And we're going to remove that corner. The opposite end is similar, except that we're only going to measure 30 millimeters out and then draw a diagonal line and remove that corner. I'm going to go do that on my bandsaw. And here we go. And here's one. Here's what the cut made. Now, when you make the other one, it is a mirror opposite. So the flange, in other words, goes the other direction. So just be sure you don't make 2 exactly the same. Now we're going to go ahead and place these in their location. What we also need to do is on the bottom, draw a line down the center of the entire extrusion. And we will now go place these where they are supposed to go on the bottom of the cabin floor. Now we're going to place these extrusions along the line of pre-drilled holes that runs along the edge of the floor. Now, of course, it will end there, but for now, we want to use this outer set of holes, which goes all the way up to the front with some gaps in them, running along both sides. Now, with the cabin floor upside down, we're going to place the extrusions along that row of pre-drilled holes we talked about. Now, it's best to first draw a line that is in line with the holes. And then it is best to also mark the exact center of the extrusion. And remember, look at your plans, but the flange goes towards the center of the floor. And what we're going to do is line up the center of the flange with the center of the holes. So the extrusion's going to cover the holes right in the center. Now, what's also important is that we're going to take a measurement after we get this clamped down. The two extrusions are now in place and clamped to the skin. The idea, of course, is that the extrusion is centered along that line of pre-drilled holes. And one quick measurement you can take to confirm that everything is set properly before we flip the skin over is that the distance from this edge to the edge on the other side is exactly 400 millimeters. And that is important because our engine mount is going to end up going on top of these extrusions. So this should be centered over the holes, and the distance from this edge to the one on the opposite side is 400 millimeters. We flipped the floor upside down so that it is now right side up, I guess I should say, and have both extrusions clamped in place. In fact, you'll note this one right here. Now, it's okay that it's sticking out slightly beyond the skin, and that's okay because we will trim this off. But the important thing is that I see the line through all of the holes going all the way back, and I measured from this edge to the opposite edge to get exactly 400 millimeters. So we know that we have this in place on both sides. As we look towards the back, I continue to see the line through the pre-drilled holes, which means I have it correctly aligned. And then, of course, at one point we go beyond the skin all the way back, and I have that clamped in place. In fact, you can double check a measurement that we need to confirm is that from this edge at this location to the opposite side is 880 millimeters. We can now go ahead and drill through these pre-drilled holes once we are happy that we have both ends in place. And as I mentioned, when we're all done and have this drilled and clecoed in place, we will trim off the edge to make this flush. It cannot extend beyond that front edge of the skin. Now I'm just going to use a number 40 size drill for now and cleco this in place on both sides all the way to the end of the skin. Eventually we'll have to put the fuselage sides back on so that we can catch up with the holes that will go into this section here. As you drill through the pre-drilled holes, you will come to the end of the skin. Then you should continue marking where holes should be drilled every 30 millimeters, following the same pattern of the skin. The exception is at the very end of the extrusion, where the first 7 holes from the end should be 15 millimeters apart. So if you count the first 7 holes, they are 15 millimeters apart, and then they go back to the 30 millimeters apart as they are on the rest of the skin. Go ahead and pre-drill all of these holes on the extrusion, because we will use those holes as templates to drill into the side fuselage skin. I have flipped the floor upside down, and what we need to do now is to trim off the ends of the extrusion where they, if and where they go past the end of the flange. And then the next time you have the fuselage side on, you can use these holes to drill from the bottom into the side skin, and that will complete the drilling for the extrusion. Now, these holes eventually need to be enlarged for an A5 size rivet, but of course we can do that later. Now is a good time to mate the firewall to the front of our bottom skin. I have it facing up, and you should draw a line across the front 20 millimeters in from the edge. And of course we still have our center line. So what I'm going to do now is set the firewall up here so that we can match the lip of the firewall to the very front of our floor bottom. And I'm setting our firewall up. And if you can see here, I have the very center of the firewall marked. We should have a line down the center, and I'm going to match that center line up with the center of the floor bottom. And I'm going to put the lip of the firewall right up to that 20 millimeter line that I drew. And that way, the firewall is now perfectly perpendicular to the floor bottom, and it's centered from left to right by keeping the line lined up. And our goal is to have the front edge of the floor flush with the front of the firewall. And once you have this set up the way you like it, we're going to take a Sharpie and mark the 2 end holes that we drilled previously in the bottom of the firewall lip. And I need to go find a marquee. Sharpie marquee. Okay, I have it lined up, and I'm going to go and mark it here. And I mark at the end hole. Now I can remove the firewall. And we can bring into play 7F84, our lower bearing, which also has a set of holes that we drilled in when we had this against the bottom of the firewall. So these holes match up perfectly because they were drilled with the firewall. But now I can match up the 2 end holes with the 2 marks that I placed on And when I place those up, the good news is that my center line also matches. And I can use this thick bearing now as a template to drill the rest of my holes into the floor. I'll go ahead and do that and cleco it so I keep it nice and steady and accurate. Then I can remove this and have all of the holes finished across the front. and the 2 center holes I'll have to re-drill through the bottom channel 7F81, and we'll be all set now for mounting the firewall when it comes time to the front of our cabin bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and drill all 8 of these holes into the skin. I have flipped the floor upside down and laid it flat on the table, and I have attached the cabin side and then placed the extrusion, our bottom longeron, on top through the holes we've previously made, clecoed them, and what this will allow us to do is to now drill through the remainder of the holes in the longeron and into the cabin side. And we will now have completed the installation of the bottom longerons. We have the bearing clamped around the hole, and a good way to locate its exact position is to turn around, and what you're trying to do is to get it centered so that you can see the bearing equal distance around the edges there. See, it's just peaking equal distance around the top and the sides. And that's the best way to locate it, because this hole, of course, is larger than the size of the opening of the bearing. That's to allow the a collar to fit through the hole, and then you'll clamp it down with the bearing. So I'm going to go ahead and rivet. Go ahead and rivet the bearing on. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and drill and cleco the bearing on in this location, and then we'll locate the bottom half of it. The next step is to install the lower bearing half. Now, we could install it just like that, but I do recommend taking the torque tube 7C22, sticking one end of it into the hole, and then putting the lower bearing half up against it nice and tight. That way you're ensured when you go ahead and drill and cleco these holes for this lower bearing that you've got a nice tight fit. And there'll be no surprises then by using the tube in its location there. Now we're ready to prepare for the tunnel that's going to attach to 7F11-1. Now, I have 7F11-1. This is the back side. Here's the lip at the top. We need to prepare 2 standard L angles. And the critical dimensions are that at the bottom of 7F11-1, we need to make a mark that is 240 millimeters apart off the center, so 120 millimeters from the center to each end, and then the angles will meet at the top. Now, when lining these up, you want to be just outside the hole so they don't interfere with the hole, and you'll have to trim the top of the L angles so that they fit nicely underneath the lip, and then trim them off at the very bottom here. This L angle will come up very close to the opening. You don't want to obscure the opening here. And then go ahead and rivet these on. Notice that you will not drill the rivets here except from the back side, because we already drilled the holes for the bearing up here. But we will add 3 additional rivets down at the bottom and then 1 at the very top. Now we're ready to start installing the tunnel, which is 7F11-4. Now, first thing I did was extend some lines from the edge of each of the L angles, which was the 240 millimeters apart. And those are going to be the edges of the tunnel when we place them in there. Now, the only fabrication we need to the tunnel is to make a cutout in this area. Now, the distance to measure from the front to where the cutout is going to be is simply the distance between here and 7F10-1. Okay, so it needs to fit in here, and then it will ride on top of 7F10-1. So the way this is going to work is simply to slide it in here, and it will go on top of each of the L angles. And it will go in just like that. Now the line, of course, helps me adjust this so that it is correct, so on both sides, and of course up and over the ridge there. Now you will need to trim the top flange of the L angles on both sides here, this side and this side, in order to get this lip to fit underneath. This will fit underneath the lip, and the L angle before trimming won't allow it to go all the way in. So one of the flanges on each L angle will need to be trimmed to get this to smoothly go all the way forward. Our next step will be to install 7F11-4A, which are these L angles that are opened up. And these will go down here on both sides. And we will have a set of rivets into the floor and into the tunnel, so on both flanges, and then also a row of rivets, and these are all going to be A4 pitched 40 up and down the tunnel, and then on both flanges of the angle. And then finally, we're going to use another piece which will go on top of 7F10-1. And the only caveat is on this short piece that fits right in here, we have to make sure that when we drill our rivets, that when we actually go to set the rivets, we want the rivets to be pointed up. Because we can't have the rivet stem protrude down into below this area as the landing gear goes down there. So this row that goes here will have to be pulled from the bottom of this metal. The rest of these rivets in here can of course go forward as normally would be intuitive. And I might also mention that when drilling the holes for the rivets that go into the L angles on both sides, don't start up too high in this corner, or you'll never be able to get your rivet nose in there. So don't drill yourself into a corner where you can't actually place a rivet. Prepare the seatbelt attachment as per the plans. And then, when locating it, we want a spot 300 millimeters back from the front, and then 180 millimeters from the floor up. And what that will do is locate the point that will go right through the opening, the 5/16 opening in the seatbelt attachment. And then the other end will go 90 millimeters from the top of the channel. And that will place it approximately like that. And we'll go ahead and drill the 5 holes. These eventually will be A5. On the inside has to be a 40,000th strip of aluminum as a doubler to help the seatbelt from pulling through. So I'll make a strip of aluminum, same thickness, about a 40,000th aluminum, and drill the same pattern of holes, and that will go on the inside, and the rivets then will go all the way through. Now we need to prepare 7C3-3. Map out, according to your plans, the location of the 4 holes. These are going to be 3/4 inch holes. And what I did was put a cross through them so I could find the center, and that's where I'll use a paddle bit to drill the 4 3/4 inch holes. And then I can use a jigsaw to finish off the opening so that it looks like it does in the plans. And now I can use a jigsaw to carefully cut out the remaining portions and make it look like the plans tell us it should look like. I'm going to use a handheld jigsaw with a very fine tooth blade. And now I'll clean this up with a hand file. And now we can install 7F8 and 3. These are floor stiffeners, and in preparation I drew center lines down each flange. These will help us locate where to drill through the pre-drilled holes. We're simply going to find these parallel holes along the fuselage floor and locate the flanges right on top like that. Now, of course, we're going to drill up through the bottom. I'll flip this whole thing over and drill through the holes in the bottom, keeping this centered and using the lines I drew to keep this centered evenly amongst the holes. At the very end, there are no more holes over here, and that's okay because we'll have another piece later on that will drill through this. So we'll just use the pre-drilled holes to locate this. 7F8-3 will be located back at the next set of parallel holes with the longer floor stiffener. Same thing, we will drill from the bottom. And we do need to make sure that we continue the holes at pitch 40 all the way over to the very edge. And we need to trim the ends so that they're even with the side of the floor skin. For installing 7C3-3, we're going to place it on the floor on the pilot side. We want to center it just to the right of the center of the opening, the circle opening. And I had to trim mine just a little bit in order for it to fit nice and flat on the floor. And we will put our A4 rivets, going to be pitch 50. I marked them and pre-drilled them along the bottom. And one will catch the flange, and one will catch the flange at the other end. And I made a pair of lines so I could place it accurately. I'm going to be careful not to place it in a way that's going to interfere with the existing rivets on either flange. So I will be in between the rivets, the existing rivets on each flange.